It's 5:05. Why don't we go ahead and start? Um, Thank you. Looks like we've started the recording. So I want to just thank you all for coming tonight to another exciting event celebrating the work of John Ruskin, the Victorian polymath, whose intellectual tendrils reach into such varied fields as art criticism, labor issues, the environment, and much, much more. My name's Tyson Gaskill. I'm the relatively recently elected president of the Ruskin Art Club, which is founded in 1888, and that makes it one of the oldest continuously active clubs in California. Our mission is to promote John Ruskin's vision of the unity of art and life and the arts as a catalyst for social transformation here now in the 21st century. And here to continue that important mission is the executive director of our organization and the intellectual heir to Ruskin, Gabriel Meyer. Now, a bit about Gabriel. He's also the consummate polymath. He's a poet, an award-winning foreign correspondent who's covered war zones in Europe, Asia, and Africa. He's been awarded an honorary doctorate by the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology at UC Berkeley and an honorary doctorate from Lancaster University in the UK. His book on Jerusalem's Church of the Holy Sepulchre, called The Testimony of Stones, is forthcoming. We've been fortunate to have him involved with the Ruskin Art Club since 1998, and I say this because he's lectured widely on Ruskinian themes and has helped put us on the global map of Ruskinian studies. Just last year, he was at Notre Dame talking about Ruskin's views on ecology. His essay, Ruskin and the California Dream, appears in the latest edition of the Ruskin Review. And if all that hasn't exhausted you and made you wonder what you've accomplished, he's also a companion of the Guild of St. George, the foundation set up by Ruskin in the UK to promote his thinking. Gabriel will be speaking tonight on the law of help, Ruskin's moral vision of connection. Gabe, please take it away. We'll have some Q&A after he is finished. So enjoy.
Thank you, Tyson. You'll excuse my kind of raspy voice and my sniffling tonight. I love living in Southern California, but my sinuses don't always love it. So please excuse my my allergies tonight. Coherence is not the first thing you think of when considering the work of the 19th century art and social critic John Ruskin. Ruskin himself alluded to this dynamism when he once said to an audience in one of his public lectures, quote, "Perhaps some of my hearers this evening may have occasionally heard it stated of me that I am rather apt to contradict myself. I hope I am exceedingly apt to do so. For myself, I am never satisfied that I have handled a subject properly till I have contradicted myself at least 3 times. But once must do for this evening." His lectures to university students at Oxford in the 1870s and 80s might start with the state of painting in contemporary England, but would often task audiences with following his argument through a blizzard of bewildering examples and analogies drawn from metallurgy, the ancient Greeks, mythology, and rock formations in the Alps. He once apologized during a lecture for having announced his subject as crystallography, but in fact spending most of his time talking about Cistercian architecture. The maverick art critic Dave Hickey, who died just this past November and gave, by the way, one of the Ruskin lectures for the Ruskin Art Club in, I think, 2003, put his finger on it when he realized that Ruskin's protean kaleidoscopic prose was Ruskin thinking on the page. It was a really great insight. I'm quoting David Hickey now. Ruskin's writing cleaves to the world. It rides the fulcrum of cognition and sensation. So when we are reading him, we are never reading books or encountering thought. We are dwelling in the realm of sense, reading Ruskin writing and experiencing the flow of Ruskin thinking on the edge of sensation. The poet Robert Pinsky, the former poet laureate of the United States, in a lecture on Ruskin's famous essay, The Work of Iron, compared Ruskin's method to jazz riffs, wherein the players take us down all sorts of improvisational detours, all the while grounded in the diction of a single melody. It's an important and I think a fitting comparison. The apparent improvisations of Ruskin's mind, the bewildering scope of his interests, aesthetics, science, economics, architecture, philosophy, mythology, botany, sociology, are grounded finally in a complex underlying unity. As one of Ruskin's great American commentators, John Rosenberg, puts it in his magisterial The Darkening Glass, a portrait of Ruskin's genius, by the way, one of the best single books on Ruskin. Quote, possibly the clearest sign of the unity of Ruskin's thought is that it is impossible to pick it up in isolated fragments. To seize on any single idea is to grasp at one end or the other the whole interlocking complex. This is a vital insight, and I think one that helps us appropriate Ruskin today. Ruskin's views, always evolving, always changing on various aesthetic, economic, and social issues, seen in isolation or in isolated citations, may not satisfy a modern reader, but it is the dynamic underlying coherence of Ruskin's vision of nature, society, and the human, his holistic aspirations, his seeking of coherence, what Mark Frost has called his ecological mentality. Ruskin did not merely think about ecology, he thought ecologically, that I would suggest draws us to him in the 21st century. From Mark Frost, the structure of Ruskin's writings, the way he constructed arguments and discourses, the way he made connections and formed systems of thought, reflected and mirrored the processes and practices of ecology as he described them. End quote. This coherence, I maintain, centers around Ruskin's notion of the law of help. The law of help is not only at the heart of Ruskin's studies, but more importantly, to the challenge his thought and vision posed to his contemporaries in Victorian England, and I would argue poses to us today. We're going to focus tonight on the final volume of Ruskin's Modern Painters, a monumental work, initially intended as a defense of his artistic hero, J.M.W. Turner, against the painter's academic critics, but eventually expanding to 5 volumes and published in irregular installments over a period of 17 years, from 1843 to 1860. It is arguably the greatest single meditation on what it means to see in any language. In Art and Illusion, the Austrian critic Ernst Gombrich pinpoints, quote, the vast treatise of modern painters as the last and most persuasive book in the tradition that starts with Plato and Vasari, in which the history of art is interpreted as progress toward visual truth. While we're going to focus on the final volume in the series, I actually can't resist quoting a particularly exuberant passage, one of my favorites, from the first volume, written when Ruskin was just 24, wherein Ruskin contrasts Turner's depiction of waterfalls with the tame and careless efforts of other modern artists, of water as painted by Turner. And here you have the Turner painting in front of you. Quote, you will find nothing in the waterfalls, even of our best painters, but springing lines of parabolic descent and splashing shapeless foam. And in consequence, though they may make you understand the swiftness of the water, They never let you feel the weight of it. The stream in their hands looks active, not supine, as if it leaped, not as if it fell. It tumbles over a high fall like this, and it is when we have lost the parabolic line and arrived at the catenary, when we have lost the spring of the fall and arrived at the plunge of it, that we really begin to feel its weight and wildness. It is then that it begins to writhe and twist and sweep out zone after zone in wilder stretching as it falls, and to send down the rocket-like lance-pointed whizzing shafts at its side, sounding for the bottom. This is Ruskin's own drawing of those same waterfalls, full of a visual evocation of that language, I might say. As you all know, there's been a major revival of interest in Ruskin and his writings, particularly since the 1970s, culminating in the centennial of Ruskin's death in 2000 and the bicentennial of his birth a few years ago in 2019. But as one scholar wisely cautions, with Ruskin, we have a superfluity of writers about him and a deficiency of readers. So, reflecting that admonition, you are going to hear a lot of Ruskin tonight. In fact, my method is going to involve walking us through some principal passages in Modern Painters, Volume 5, and letting the old man speak for himself, which is never without its dangers. I am particularly indebted to the work of Ruskin scholar Mark Frost, who has written extensively on Ruskin's Law of Help, especially his 2005 doctoral thesis, which we're going to post online on our Ruskin Art Club website soon. The Law of Help, John Ruskin's Ecological Vision, 1843 to 1886. My own reflections, such as they are very much a work in progress. Ruskin's Law of Help first appears as a principle, as a topic on its own in Chapter 1, Part 8, in Volume 5 of Ruskin's Modern Painters. Ruskin packs an extraordinary amount into its short 13 pages. In the time we have tonight, I'll only be able to sketch the highlights. Ruskin calls the law of help the most important part of our subject. In other words, the goal of the whole intellectual journey of modern painters. Many scholars note that Volume 5 is part of the great transition in Ruskin's work from mainly aesthetic concerns, painting, Turner, architecture, Venice, to economic and social reform, pointing ahead to Ruskin's 4 essays in what he calls political economy in Unto This Last, published in 1862, his critique of laissez-faire capitalism that so enraged and alienated his contemporaries. Modern Painters 5 also looks back to Ruskin's popular Elements of Drawing, published in 1857, which came out of his drawing lessons at the Working Men's College in London, and which situates the composition of a work of art within a much larger, even cosmic frame. Just a note on the Working Men's College, it was set up in the 1850s to provide a serious liberal education to working men, to laborers, something beyond the basics of evening classes and the trade school curriculum, founded to redress some of the crying ills of social inequality due to education. And Ruskin taught drawing there for more than a decade. Composition, Ruskin writes in the Elements of Drawing, means literally and simply putting several things together so as to make one thing of them, the nature and goodness of which they all have a share in producing. Thus, a musician composes an air, a musical piece, by putting notes together in certain relations. A poet composes a poem by putting thoughts and words in pleasant order, and a painter a picture by putting thoughts, forms, and colors in order. In all these cases, observe, an intended unity must be the result of composition. It is the essence of composition that everything should be in a determined place, perform an intended part, and act in that part advantageously for everything that is connected with it. He goes on, composition understood in this pure sense is the type in the arts of mankind of the providential government of the world, end quote. It's noteworthy that Ruskin begins his consideration of the law of help, his definition of the law of help, with an art reference, an echo of his earlier passage, composition may best be defined as the help of everything in the picture by everything else. We should point out here that Ruskin was among the first art critics to read paintings. That is, to focus not merely on the aesthetic external, color, scheme, relation of elements, subject matter, effects, but to ask how these various elements relate to each other and what these formal relations might mean, not only in themselves, but specifically in relationship. We might call this an iconographic reading of art, the painting as text, in which the painting is seen as an organic utterance, a miniature world. I'm reminded here of Sheila Emerson's comment that, quote, Ruskin was able to move back and forth between natural world, pictures, and writing by virtue of inherited convictions that physical creation and art are both inherently languages. Beyond this, Ruskin saw in the small universe of the canvas an expression of universal moral law. Quote, what grace of manner and refinement of habit are in society, grace of line and refinement of form are in the association of visible objects. There is no moral vice, no moral virtue, which has not its precise prototype in the art of painting, so that you may at your will illustrate the moral habit by the art or the art by the moral habit, end quote. Now, Ruskin, I think, is often misunderstood here. He was misunderstood by his contemporaries as well. By moral, Ruskin is pointing to the larger significance, the archetype or ideal revealed in the smallest details of execution. And on the other hand, the societal values, as we might say, expressed consciously or not in the forms of art. The thing to which the elements aspire and the things which their elements reveal. This, of course, is virtue in the Platonic sense, as indicative of larger significance and the larger effect of all that we do, especially in its relation to a higher good in the service of life. For example, Ruskin read the moral decline of Venice in the evolution of its architecture. Ruskin's effort to teach artists how to see, to express the truth of vision, and not merely imitate conventional aesthetic forms, was a moral, not merely aesthetic campaign. It was about the pursuit of truth. As Mark Frost again has perceptively written, quote, composition in painting was a typological representation of the organizational forces that Ruskin perceived everywhere in the wider world, end quote. Ruskin then goes on to continue his definition of the law of help beyond the example of art to comparisons with the natural world, in which the growth of leaves in the structure of clouds. He does this not only with text, but with extraordinary sketches, drawings, and graphs. I've included this wonderful drawing of dead oak leaves, not because it appears in modern painters, but because I'm so fond of this drawing, I couldn't resist including it. Ruskin's, all of Ruskin's work is full of these extraordinary studies which reveal his own process, his own attempt to understand the form of everything that he sees, its essential architecture. These Beauvais drawings of clouds, which appear in modern painters, Ruskin used in order to develop his argument on the laws of perspective for clouds. And this extraordinary graph, one of many, which appears in Modern Painters 5, this one, Cloud Perspectives Rectilinear, illustrates the application of architectural perspective to the representation of cloud forms. Ruskin is here trying to help the painter understand how the laws of perspective govern the depiction of skies, the architecture of clouds, even the architecture of the motion of clouds. Ruskin begins Modern Painters 5, prefaces the chapter on the law of help with two majestic meditations on leaf beauty, a study of tree growth, and the beauty of clouds, contemplating in scientific detail the organic processes by which vegetation and atmospheres compose themselves. The titles themselves are indicative. The earth veil on the soil, the skin of the earth, the leaf orders, the bud, the branch, the stem, the leaf shadows, leaves motionless. And then going on of cloud beauty, the cloud balancing, the cloud flux, the cloud chariots, the angel of the sea on rain clouds. It is a mirror of these elaborate reflections really that we find in Modern Painters 1 on the elements of nature, clouds, water, vegetation in Turner's landscapes. These chapters in the first volume of Modern Painters from 1843, where Ruskin writes about of truth of clouds, of truth of water, of truth of space, delineating Turner's excellence against other landscape traditions. This also indicates to us something to note the kind of symphonic character of modern painters, the way that themes come back again, themes get developed. We have a recapitulation of themes. So this wonderful section on leaves and clouds that then mirrors that earlier treatment of aspects of Turner. I'm quoting now. In a plant, the taking away of any one part injures the rest. Hurt or remove any portion of the sap, bark, or pith, the rest is injured. If any part enters into that state in which it no more assists the rest, and thus becomes helpless, we call it also dead. The power which causes the several portions of the plant to help each other, we call life. We may take away the branch of a tree without much harm to it, but not the animal's limb. Thus, intensity of life is also intensity of helpfulness, completeness of depending of each part on all the rest. The ceasing of this help is what we call corruption, and in proportion to the perfectness of the help is the dreadfulness of the laws. The more intense life has been, the more terrible its corruption, end quote. As Frost summarizes the lessons Ruskin drew from trees, the apparently limited existence of the leaves still permitted purposeful creativity, for tree growth was always visibly the result of a volition on the part of the leaf, meeting an external force or fate to which it is never passively subjected. The will or aim of those sprays in steady inheritance of resolution to reach forward in the search for light, made them as freely expressive as Gothic builders. Active but never competitive, subject to no hierarchical command structure, but to laws of environmental survival that demanded mutualistic creativity, the leaves were not controlled by a central authority, but part of a joyful collective effort that began with individual will. There's so many drawings in modern painters where Ruskin then begins to draw our attention to the ways in which leaf forms, vegetative forms play their role in the creation of architecture. But we can't get into all that tonight. Then Ruskin, after talking about leaves and clouds, then Ruskin brings in geology, crystallography to be exact, into the mix in a remarkable reflection on the evolution of dust. I kid you not. It's one of the great set pieces in all of Ruskin, one of the glories of this chapter. So I don't think we ought to deprive ourselves of it. It's a little long, and I've done a little trimming. Quote, perhaps the best, though the most familiar example we could take of the nature and power of consistence will be that of the possible changes in the dust we tread on. Exclusive of animal decay, we can hardly arrive at a more absolute type of impurity than the mud or slime of a damp, overtrodden path in the outskirts of a manufacturing town. That slime we shall find in most cases composed of clay or brick dust, which is burnt clay, mixed with soot, a little sand, and water. All these elements are at helpless war with each other and destroy reciprocally each other's nature and power, competing and fighting for place at every tread of your foot. Sand squeezing out clay, and clay squeezing out water, and soot meddling everywhere and defiling the whole. Let us suppose that this ounce of mud is left in perfect rest, and that its elements gather together like to like, so that their atoms may get into the closest possible relations. Well, let the clay begin. Ridding itself of all foreign substance, it gradually becomes a white earth, already very beautiful, and fit, with help of congealing fire, to be made into finest porcelain and painted on and be kept in king's palaces. Leave it still quiet to follow its own instinct of unity, and it becomes not only white, but clear. Not only clear, but hard. Not only clear and hard, but so set that it can deal with light in a wonderful way and gather out of the loveliest blue rays only, refusing the rest. We call it then a sapphire. Such being the consummation of the clay, we give similar permission of quiet to the sand. It also becomes first a white earth, then proceeds to grow clear and hard, and at last arranges itself in mysterious, infinitely fine parallel lines, which have the power of reflecting not merely blue rays, but the blue, green, purple, and red rays in the greatest beauty in which they can be seen through any hard material whatsoever. We call it then an opal. In the next order, the soot sets to work. It cannot make itself white at first, but instead of being discouraged, tries harder and harder, and comes out clear at last, and the hardest thing in the world. And for the blackness that it had, obtains in exchange the power of reflecting all the rays of the sun at once in the vividest blaze that any solid thing can shoot. We call it then a diamond. Last of all, the water purifies or unites itself. And for the ounce of slime which we had by political economy of competition, we have by political economy of cooperation, a sapphire, an opal, and a diamond set in the midst of a star of snow. Ruskin will return to this extraordinary topic in the Ethics of the Dust. written in 1865, a remarkable and supremely quirky published dialogue with the young scholars of Winnington School, a progressive school for girls, where Ruskin occasionally lectured on scientific subjects. I'm going to read a short excerpt from Ethics, in which Ruskin describes the formation of crystals in a highly symbolic and personified way, doubtless in an accommodation to the temper of his young students, but in terms that reflect his concept of the law of help. Two or more minerals, I'm quoting now, two or more minerals of different natures agree somehow between themselves how much space each will want. Agree which of them will give way to the others at this junction, or in what measure each will accommodate itself to the other's shape. And then each takes its permitted shape and allotted share of space, yielding or being yielded to as it builds, till each crystal has fitted itself perfectly and gracefully to its differently natured neighbor. With a touch of humor, doubtless prodded by the objections of his young charges, he admits that crystals are not always cooperative. Sometimes they yield the required place with perfect grace and courtesy, forming fantastic but exquisitely finished groups. And sometimes they will not yield at all, but fight furiously for their places, losing all shape and honor and even their own likeness in the contest. What was emerging out of all of these botanical, geological, and climatological studies, let alone his perspectives on art over the whole span of modern painters, is a notion that the organic law of compositional creativity he was discovering was universally applicable and included as a logical outgrowth the nature of human society. From this perspective, Ruskin's contemporaries, many of whom found Ruskin's shift after 1860 from art criticism to social and economic reform incomprehensible, a brutal departure, hadn't been paying attention. Social concern is a thread that runs through all Ruskin's work, even when he's dealing with what appear to be purely aesthetic issues. For example, in the famous Nature of Gothic chapter in The Stones of Venice, Ruskin seamlessly flows from a discussion of the relationship of geography to architectural form into a denunciation of British labor practices and the treatment of factory workers. Again, as Mark Frost notes, Ruskin's discovery of organic principles in art and the organic print patterns of nature led inevitably to the articulation of an organic politics, an organic political ecology. For Ruskin, every aspect of human or non-human existence in a state of harmony was grounded by a law of composition in which mutuality, interaction, and process were central. Those of you who've read philosophy will spot the Platonic resonances. No surprise there, Ruskin read a little Plato every day in the morning, and in his later years wrote his translation of the Laws each morning into his diary. From Plato, Laws 10, quote, "Let us persuade the young man by our own discourse that all things are ordered systematically by him who cares for the world, all with a view to the preservation and excellence of the whole, whereof each part, so far as it can, has an action and a passion appropriate to it." And then another quote, "No more will pilots or generals or house managers, nor yet statesmen or any other such persons, find that the many and great thrive apart from the few and small. For even masons say that big stones are not well laid without little stones." More is at work here, Ruskin asserts, however, than simple mutuality, the delineation of an ecosystem. This is the heart of his argument. I put this up so we can follow it together. A pure or holy state of anything, therefore, is that in which all its parts are helpful or consistent. They may or may not be homogeneous. The highest or organic purities are composed of many elements in an entirely helpful state. The highest and first law of the universe and the other name of life is therefore help. The other name of death is separation. Government and cooperation are in all things and eternally the laws of life. Anarchy and competition eternally and in all things the laws of death. It's very important to note that Ruskin is not underscoring some sort of ecology of order, some kind of stasis. This is a dynamic, organic principle, a principle of process and energy as well as result. The highest and first law of the universe and the other name of life is help. In a wonderful passage in the middle of the chapter, Ruskin underlines this energy and process again in terms of artistic invention. Quote, now, invention in art signifies an arrangement in which everything in the work is thus consistent with all things else and helpful to all else. It is the greatest and rarest of all qualities of art. In work which is not composed, there may be many beautiful things, but they do not help each other. They, at the best, only stand beside and more usually compete with and destroy each other. Generally, in falsely composed work, if anything be taken away, the rest will look better because the attention is less distracted. In true composition, everything not only helps everything a little, but helps with its utmost power. Every atom is in full energy, and all that energy is kind. Not a line nor spark of color, but is doing its very best, and that best is aid. True composition is inexplicable. No one can explain how the notes of a Mozart melody or the folds of a piece of Titian's drapery produce their essential effects on each other. If you do not feel it, no one can, by reasoning, make you feel it. True invention is not only the highest quality of art, but simply the most wonderful act or power of humanity. What Ruskin is saying is, again, to summarize, all that cooperates and incorporates and unites for the sake of the whole is life. All that separates, divides, and isolates, anarchy and competition, is death. The eternally and in all things is worth noticing. The life-death dichotomy is present in its smallest manifestations as well as in its greater ones. This is a universal principle pervading the warp and woof of all life, all forms. As Ruskin writes later in Modern Painters 5, the system of the world is entirely one. Small things and great are part of one mighty whole. It's not difficult to discern in Ruskin's law of help a wholesale critique of the laissez-faire capitalism of his day. In fact, as we know, he followed up the completion of Modern Painters with the critique of the economics of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and John Stuart Mill in his essays on political economy that make up perhaps his masterpiece, Unto This Last, published in 1862. For Ruskin, the organic social life he envisioned had been divided, compartmentalized, and denatured by an economic order dedicated to self-interest and the exclusive quest for material wealth and the power and security it claimed to purchase. Like Marx, Ruskin was not a critic simply of the abuses of the capitalist order of his day, but of the system itself. Deeper than Marx, however, Ruskin questioned the anthropological assumptions upon which the whole industrial economic system was based. It wasn't simply a matter of who was running the factory, but the factory itself and the mindset that produced it. For Ruskin, Adam Smith was not wrong simply about economic theory, he was wrong about the human person. Ruskin admonished the notion of progress through self-interest with its inherent appeal to radical individualism with, quote, "Independence you had better cease to talk of, for you are dependent not only on every act of people you have never heard of, who are living round you, but on every past act of what has been dust for 1,000 years. So also does the course of 1,000 years to come depend on the little perishing strength that is in you." This is from Forrest Clavigera, his letters to the working men of England, written in the 1870s. From unto this last, quote, "The economist," says Ruskin, "operates on the basis that avarice and the desire for progress are constant elements, considering the human being merely as a covetous machine, examined by what laws, labor, purchase, and sale, the greatest accumulative wealth is obtainable." Ruskin emphatically rejected this reduction of humans to an economic unit of labor. It would be so if the servant were I'm quoting now, "It would be so if the servant were an engine of which the motive power was steam, magnetism, gravitation, or any other agent of calculable force. But the being, on the contrary, an engine whose motive power is soul. The force of this very peculiar agent as an unknown quantity enters into all the political economist's equations without his knowledge and falsifies every one of their results." End quote. The effect of this model of man as covetous machine, fueled by greed, competition, self-interest, and the illusion of self-sufficiency, is to create conditions in which the network of natural human bonds, the nursery of virtue and care, decays, and human nature itself, in the end, is deformed. From The Nature of Gothic and the Stones of Venice, quote, "We have much studied and much perfected of late the great civilized invention of the division of labor, only we give it a false name. It is not, truly speaking, the labor that is divided, but the men, divided into mere segments of men, broken into fragments and crumbs of life, so that all the little piece of intelligence that is left in a man is not enough to make a pin or a nail, but exhausts itself in making the point of a pin or the head of a nail. And the great cry that rises from all our manufacturing cities, louder than their furnace blast, is all in very deed for this, that we manufacture everything there is except men. We blanch cotton and strengthen steel and refine sugar and shape pottery, but to brighten, to strengthen, to refine, or to form a single living spirit never enters into our estimate of advantages." End quote. Humans alone are not wounded in this process. Nature itself is maimed by being reduced from a living web of relationships and obligations to an inert resource ready to be harnessed to human pleasure and profit, raw material to be refashioned for human exploitation. The human failure to see life and to love life in all its interconnectedness, its wholeness, Ruskin feared, absent a fundamental reorientation, foretold ruin for both humans and nature. Quote, all the diseases of mind leading to fatalist ruin consist primarily from this isolation. They are the concentration of man upon himself. With the law of help, Ruskin was leveling a wholesale critique at another quarter, the evolutionary theories of Charles Darwin. On the origin of species, or more completely, on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life, was first published in 1859. The Descent of Man followed in 1871. Ruskin's relation with Darwin and with Darwinism is a complex topic and one that plays itself out over decades. I'm not going to do it justice here. If you're interested, there's a fine chapter in Robert Hewison's study, Ruskin and His Contemporaries, and also a broader, even more comprehensive treatment of Ruskin and the science of his time in Professor Sandra Kemp's pioneering essay, Ruskin and Science, which we're hoping also to upload to the Ruskin Art Club website. Darwin and Ruskin actually knew each other. Ruskin and Darwin first met in 1837 under the aegis of the geologist William Buckland, soon after Darwin had finished his epic expedition to South America on the Beagle. And the two apparently had a long conversation on that occasion. Ruskin's great American friend, Charles Eliot Norton, reintroduced them 30 years later, and Darwin paid Ruskin a visit to his London residence. It was on this visit that Ruskin was astonished to discover that Darwin could not draw, and moreover did not appreciate the beauties of Ruskin's prized Turner paintings. The two met cordially at Brentwood, Ruskin's estate in the Lake District, in 1879, and wouldn't one love to be a fly on that wall? Unlike the larger Victorian public, Ruskin was not shaken principally by the biblical implications of Darwin's evolutionary theories. While raised as a fervent evangelical Christian, Ruskin by 1858 had become something of a free-thinking theist, and in any case had a profound appreciation, as we have seen, for the complexity of evolutionary processes. What horrified Ruskin, I think, in the end, were the social implications of Darwinism. What the biologist Thomas Huxley called the survival of the fittest, the notion of creative evolution as a Malthusian struggle for resources with its implications for social policies based on competition, racial stratification, radical individualism, and violence. Ruskin was prescient in this, I think, seeing in the germ of Darwin's theories, or better, in the views of Darwinists, such as Herbert Spencer, applications that would later take shape in 20th century social Darwinism, with, among its many horrors, state-sponsored eugenics and the Nazi Holocaust. For Ruskin, Darwin's reductionist utilitarian universe was the biological corollary of laissez-faire capitalism's covetous machine, the economics of human life based on and reduced to rivalry, division, and acquisitiveness. As Ruskin once sadly remarked to his students in a mood of black disappointment at the end of his 14-year tenure as the first Slade Professor of Fine Art at Oxford in 1884, "You are all of you resolving yourselves, and that with rapidity, into this kind of British person, consumer of all things consumable, producer of nothing, a god to himself and to all the world, an incarnate calamity." End quote. I wonder how many teachers would have the guts to say that to their students today. Let me add a parenthesis to this discussion. I participated in a colloquium some years ago on future trends, during which the evolutionary biologist Martin Novak gave a fascinating presentation on the ecology of cooperation. Novak is professor of mathematical biology at Harvard and an award-winning researcher in the field that studies the role of cooperation in evolution. His best-known work, published in 2011, is Super Cooperators, Altruism, Evolution, or Why We Need Each Other to Succeed, co-authored with Roger Highfield. Natural selection in a well-mixed population favors the selfish, the cheater, the deceiver. However, as the author writes in this sweeping panoramic survey, cooperation has been with us since the dawn of man, indeed, perhaps before the dawn, in the pre-life, when two complementary molecular sequences possibly catalyzed reactions. The resonances with Ruskin's universal law of help come readily to mind, at least they do to a Ruskinian. Novak argues that natural selection alone is an inadequate evolutionary paradigm, or at the very least, natural selection is not itself empowered solely by competition, as Darwin himself recognizes in The Descent of Man in 1871. He writes, "There can be no doubt that a tribe including many members who are always ready to give aid to each other and to sacrifice themselves for the common good would be victorious over other tribes, and this would be natural selection." Quoting from a December 2006 article by Novak in Science, quote, "Evolution is based on a fierce competition between individuals and should therefore only reward selfish behavior. Every gene, every cell, every organism should be designed to promote its own evolutionary success at the expense of competitors. Yet we observe cooperation on many levels of biological organization. Cooperation means that selfish replicators forego some of their reproductive potential to help one another. Genes cooperate in genomes. Chromosomes cooperate in eukaryotic cells. Cells cooperate in multicellular organisms. There are many examples for cooperation among animals. Humans are the champions of cooperation. From hunter-gatherer societies to nation states, cooperation is the decisive organizing principle of human society. Novak identifies 5 mechanisms for cooperation. Direct reciprocity, I help you, you help me. Indirect reciprocity, most important in Novak's analysis. I help you, another helps me. Influenced by reputation, in other words. I help you and become known as a helper. Others are inclined to help me based on my reputation. Novak asserts that indirect reciprocity is what makes us human because it's selected for social intelligence and human language. Spatial selections, neighbors help each other, group selections, what Darwin referred to above. Groups of cooperators outcompete other groups. Kin selection, cooperation with genetic relatives. Novak also brings many other theoretical models to bear in his elucidation of the cooperative principle: game theory, spatial games, phylogenetics in biology, the study of the evolutionary history of organisms, and others. Obviously, this is an ongoing field of research, but the correspondences between these two ecological models, Ruskin's and Novak's, are intriguing. In 1884, Ruskin gave one of the last of his public lectures, actually 2 lectures, The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century. It's a much commented on lecture these days, a kind of proto-environmental warning about climate change. They're not the most coherent of Ruskin's lectures, but perhaps that's due to their character as chronicles of Ruskin's decades-long meteorological observations, his cloud studies, that seemed to indicate that something new and profoundly troubling was happening to weather patterns in the Lake District. Some climate scientists today date the emergence of what some have called the Anthropocene, a new geological epoch in which the human species for the first time has become a geophysical force in its own right, to the years of Ruskin's intense atmospheric observations. Ruskin, in fact, startled his audience at the outset of the lecture with the assertion that a new age in natural history had dawned, the era of the storm cloud. Quote, "This wind is the plague wind of the 8th decade of years in the 19th century, a period which will assuredly be recognized in future meteorological history as one of the phenomena hitherto unrecorded in the courses of nature and characterized preeminently by the almost ceaseless action of this calamitous wind." End quote. Ruskin struggled to describe strange cloud formations and violent weather all across Europe, from Britain to Sicily, that he suspected had something to do with the disastrous effects of industrialization on the atmosphere. A man-made plague wind or plague cloud that was choking off the light, blanched sun, blinded grass, blinded man. In an attempt to chart the progress of this phenomenon, Ruskin exhibited drawings and paintings he had made over the course of his life, dating back to 1845. Some of what Ruskin observed was affected clearly by the volcanic eruption of Krakatoa in August of 1883 and its massive ash clouds, which killed thousands and had major effects on global weather patterns and temperatures. But as early as 1871, long before Krakatoa, in his letters to the working men of England in Fors Clavigera, he had lamented that, quote, "the sky is covered with gray cloud, not rain cloud, but a dry black veil, which no ray of sun can pierce. And almost everywhere the leaves of the trees are shaking fitfully, as they do before a thunderstorm, not only violently, but enough to show the passing to and fro of a strange, bitter, blighting wind." End quote. In an earlier letter, Ruskin, in Fors Clavigera, Ruskin warns that humanity's Promethean powers over the natural world might end in the destruction of humankind itself. Quote, "You can vitiate the air by your manner of life and of death to any extent. You might easily vitiate it so as to bring such a pestilence on the globe as would end all of you. On the other hand," Ruskin admonishes, "there is still time. Your power of purifying the air by dealing properly and swiftly with all substances in corruption, by absolutely forbidding noxious manufactures, and by planting in all soils the trees which cleanse and invigorate earth and atmosphere, is literally infinite. You might make every breath you draw food." End quote. While Ruskin's carefully documented meteorological observations were widely dismissed at the time, crazy old Ruskin, by the early 20th century, scientists were connecting the dots and establishing the relationship between industrial pollution and changes in the atmosphere. J.W. Graham, for example, in The Destruction of Daylight, a study in the smoke problem from 1907, indicates that industrial statistics bear out Ruskin's date for the onset of meteorological changes and the so-called storm cloud. The mid-century rapid leap in coal consumption in Britain and in Central Europe. Quote, "The devil is every bit as black as Ruskin painted him," Graham writes. "He is smoke, smoke mixed with damp," end quote. Ruskin also clearly saw that this was not a mere technological problem subject to technological fixes. The ruin of nature and the attitudes which contribute to it are reflections of the darkened state of the modern human consciousness. Quote, "You cannot love the real sun, that is to say, physical light and color, rightly, unless you love the spiritual sun, that is to say, justice and truth, rightly. That for unjust and untrue persons, there is no real joy in physical light, so that they don't even know what the word means. That the entire system of modern life is so corrupted with the ghastliest forms of injustice and untruth, carried to the point of not recognizing themselves as either. But when everybody steals, cheats, and goes to church complacently, how great is that darkness? And that is the physical result of that mental vileness, is a total carelessness of the beauty of sky or the cleanness of streams or of the life of animals and flowers. And I believe that the powers of nature are depressed or perverted together with the spirit of man. And therefore that conditions of storm and of physical darkness, such as never were before in Christian times, are developing themselves in connection also with forms of loathsome insanity, multiplying to the whole genesis of modern brains." End quote. The generating site of ecological disaster is the modern human brain, an entrenched mentality that in its profound misunderstanding of itself and of its world and of its place in the world ends up by acting existentially against itself. Solutions, Ruskin suggests, will not be found using the mechanistic language, the tools, the mentality that have helped create the problem. The ecological crisis, first glimpsed by Ruskin in the 19th century and on full display in ours, is, as Ruskin urges, in the first case at least, not a crisis of science, but of the human spirit, to be addressed adequately only by a radical shift in consciousness, in personal and cultural change, by the embrace of what a contemporary figure, Pope Francis, in his remarkable 2015 encyclical Laudato Si on the environment, has called ecological conversion. After the mid-1880s, Ruskin began his long retreat from public life. Increasingly brittle mentally, he had resigned his Oxford professorship, finding it harder and harder to concentrate, and in the grip of a growing conviction that he had failed in his efforts to inspire societal change. While his Guild of St. George, his attempt to create an ideal rural farming community, soldiered on, public support of his philanthropic efforts had never been robust. Finally, in 1889, he suffered a mental breakdown from which he never recovered and retired to his estate in the Lake District under the care of relatives. He died there in 1900. Paradoxically, the last decades of the 19th century, which saw Ruskin withdrawn from the world and convinced of the futility of his efforts, oversaw a wildfire spread of Ruskin societies and reading guilds devoted to studying Ruskin's ideas and enacting his reforms, among which was the Ruskin Art Club of 1888. His books were selling on both sides of the Atlantic. Labor unions lionized him, along with craft-based enterprises and guilds. Mohandas Gandhi read Unto This Last in 1904 and launched an agrarian movement in India on the basis of it. In Japan, intellectuals and artisans in the Meiji era and beyond were finding inspiration in aspects of Ruskin's aesthetic and social theories. Ruskin inspired utopian communal experiments, particularly in the United States. Ruskin, Florida, Ruskin, Tennessee, Ruskin, Georgia, sprang up in the years before the First World War. I want to end with an observation, one that comes out of my firsthand experience as a war correspondent. People faced with the exigencies of war know all about the law of help. It's safe to say that the people in Ukraine are having no trouble understanding what an ecology of cooperation might look like. I've had the privilege of accompanying people in the midst of conflicts in the Middle East, the Balkans, and Sudan. One of the paradoxes of war, a paradox that isn't talked about much, is that the radical solidarity war compels you to adopt, the survival consciousness it engenders, is curiously life-giving. In the midst of all the challenges one feels, with all the terrors that one has awakened from a mental and cultural sleep, and is living now perhaps for the first time in the real world. A passage from Rilke that I kept with me during my years in the Nuba Mountains of central Sudan, quote, "Whoever does not sometime or other give his full consent, his full and joyous consent to the dreadfulness of life," dread in this sense, in the old sense of awe and reverence, "to the dreadfulness of life, can never take possession of the unutterable abundance and power of our existence, can only walk on its edges, and one day when the judgment is given, will have been neither alive nor dead." End quote. I always underline that, take possession of the unutterable abundance and power of our existence. Reading now from a memoir I wrote about those years, quote, "Now on a rise as we walked deeper and deeper into the hills, a burst of cold wind blew across my face and down into the grassland, parting whole swaths of light-washed reeds in its wake, like the passage of an invisible being. In that instant, and much to my own surprise, the last weight of resistance, along with the depression that had lingered for days, like a low-grade fever, broke. All I knew was that I no longer wanted to be anywhere else but where I was, in the Nuba Mountains, alive to its beauties and dangers, and that in having made that choice, it was as if I had rubbed the sleep from my eyes." As we have seen, for Ruskin, help, cooperation, mutuality, responsibility is simply the other name for life. And making decisions to live a more authentic existence is not, I suggest, merely about adopting a few green tweaks to our lifestyle, but a holistic embrace of the real world, as people do in a crisis. To wake from the sleep of evasions and empty diversions by which we seek to escape our lives, and to take our proper place in the universe, our own universe, embracing the daily demands of our lives, our responsibilities to each other and to the natural world around us, to make the personal choices that only we can make, and to make them as if they, as Ruskin believed, were literally a matter of life and death. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Gabe. We've started talking about having you record podcasts because you not only speak so eloquently on Ruskinian themes, but You just have a naturally mellifluous baritone, even in the midst of an allergy attack. And I really appreciate I really appreciate how you brought it all around at the end there to your own very weighty experiences. Your talk is a reminder of why Ruskin is a gift that keeps giving. As I mentioned earlier, our mission is to promote John Ruskin's vision of the unity of art and life. And you've really done an admirable job unveiling some of that tonight. I too would love to have been a fly on the wall when Darwin visited Ruskin in 1879. And I completely agree that Ruskin saw the logical or perhaps illogical bloody conclusion in the 20th century to Darwin's theory. You've given us all a tremendous amount to think about, and I want to give our guests the opportunity to ask you some questions and or just muse themselves on some of the themes that you started unpacking tonight. So why don't we go to the group view for everybody, and you can raise your hands or maybe ask in the chat, and I'll try to pick judiciously on everybody here. And let me see if we've got anyone already. Okay, well, Bernard, you seem to be first up. Are you there?
Yes, I am, and I'll try to be brief. Basically, if I understand correctly, there's a conflict between conflict and cooperation in all of this which you have expressed, Gabriel. My question is, how might one best assist in the process of achieving that more lived life and in the process of cooperating? Does Ruskin or Novak, or would even you have some suggestions there? That's all.
Yep, great. Well, it's interesting, Bernie, that you would mention that. I cut a portion of the talk out just for time. I think your question is very much to the point. There's sometimes when, and it's very common when we think about overarching concepts like the Ruskin's notion of the law of health, we're apt to think first about policy implications and their implications for public life, for reforms, for law, for government-directed initiatives. And that was certainly the way many of Ruskin's social ideas were applied in the 20th century, particularly in Britain, where Ruskin's one of the patron saints of the Labour Party, and an inspiration behind the evolution of the modern welfare state. When Labour finally was established in 1906, it was found that the book that had inspired all those early union leaders and workers was Unto This Last. In fact, when Labour first entered Parliament, apparently they were waving pamphlets of Unto This Last to identify themselves. So certainly that was kind of the first way people took all this. And I think, obviously very, very, very important way to do that. But it's worth noting, Bernie, along with your question, that Ruskin's own plan of action placed more emphasis on countercultural measures, modeling a different way of life, on inner transformation, on personal responsibility, the power of choices that one makes, even against the flow, even against all the immense forces that are arrayed against you. So that was really what the Guild of St. George was early on. It was many things, but it was certainly dedicated to fostering communal experiments aimed at creating models of sustainable rural economies and of farming at a time when agriculture was being savaged, by industry. again, more personal terms, I think Ruskin really recognized that there was a spiritual basis for all of this as well, and that was avarice of greed, and that we had to reimagine human life in resistance to what Ruskin called affluenza. I love that term, affluenza, which is the psychological, sociological condition when too much is never enough. The whole basis of consumer society. So Ruskin described what you do instead as a sufficient life. And there were a number of people. There's a book called by Frederick and Vicky Alberton that is called Green Victorians. Short book, 200 pages, beautifully written, very comprehensive about these friends of Ruskin, disciples of Ruskin, people who knew Ruskin, who were living in the Lake District, who were really trying to do this in families, in different kinds of situations. And so this book is really about them and what they did, the different kinds of initiatives that they did. For example, industrialization and in one fell swoop had destroyed the livelihood of many, many widows in rural districts who made lace and textiles. And so one of the things that one of Ruskin's followers did was begin to set up linen industries that would provide work and focus the work of these women in ways that they could sell their products and be a part of rural businesses that would sustain them. So that would be, but the main thing that Ruskin really talks about is the sufficient life, a life characterized by prudent and ethical consumerism, by a kind of artful simplicity, using your creativity in your life, by the embrace of the homemade, of the real, and by a lifestyle that involves making critical and selective uses of technology. So there was very much, Ruskin really thought this has to get into the way that you live.
Thank you, Gabriel. I will
yeah.
try to put that into practice in my own life. Thank you.
There's a great quote from Modern Painters 5, where Ruskin says, "So the things to be desired for man in a healthy state are that he should not see dreams, but realities. That he should not destroy life, but save it. And that he should not be rich, but content."
Gabe, thank you. I don't know if you saw, but Margaret has a quick question in chat
Sure.
about whether you might ever publish your talk tonight in some format. Well, she's saying in the Atlantic or the Economist, but I don't know if you've thought about it in any other venue either, even on the Ruskin website.
Well, I haven't thought about anything like that yet. I gave this a version of this talk last summer at the University of Arkansas, and then I was looking forward to tonight because it gave me a chance to rework it, and add to it, and enrich it. So this was wonderful for me. I was looking forward to this. So I think all in due time we'll find some context for this.
Okay. Is that Jim there in the dark?
Yeah, it's Jim in the dark.
In the dark.
There may be symbolism here. Gabe, first thing I want to do is I want to thank you so very much for the talk. I sent you a text earlier today, told you to break a leg.
Yeah.
I think you broke both of them. In any event, you reminded me of what a wonderful book Modern Painters 5 is.
Oh.
And the complexity of that book is astonishing. Some years ago, when I was in England visiting with the Ruskin folk, we had a little conversation in a pub one night about if you were going to a desert island, what book would you take with you? And I'm a sociologist, so immediately I said onto this last.
Right.
And then one of my colleagues, my English colleagues, said, no. And you reminded me of that tonight. So I recommend to anybody who's still with us, Modern Painters 5 is a work of true, stunning, unending genius that you can go back to time and time again. He begins, you didn't mention this, Gabe, but it's one of the great endings of, the beginnings of a book. He begins the first chapter with the admonition from the Lord that our charge was simple in this world as human beings. It was to dress it and keep it, to take the earth and to dress it and keep it. And then he says immediately after that, but we haven't done too well at that, have we? And really the whole book, going back to Bernie's question, the whole book is an attempt to answer Bernie's question. What are the things that we can do in order to make this world a better place as we go? The metaphor I use all the time is we have a responsibility as human beings to move the needle. In other words, try to do something with whatever powers and strengths and time we have to move things today to a little bit better place than they were at the beginning of the day, towards the end of the day, and you as we have that strength to go forward and make things a bit better as we go. Modern Painters 5 is a stunning work of genius. I recommend it to everyone. Thank you, Gabriel, for reminding us of that.
Thank you for that, Jim. Desi, you have something you would like to share. You're muted, sorry.
I'm not good at this sort of thing. Is that work now? Can you see? No, because I knew that we were going to have this meeting. It made me think about something that I have been grappling with recently, this law of help. This is something connected to something as a psychoanalyst that I have to face all the time, because the idea that if you help a patient, you have to love the patient. And love is nowhere in the psychoanalytic literature. If you talk about love, that's sentimental. That's looked down on. So, but you have to have love to be able to help.
Yeah.
And and then I come to think, I have been working on a paper on envy and the victims of envy. And that's why I have gotten into the issue of love, that something happened to me some years ago. I had an artist patient that was so abusive with me, so nasty. It was very difficult to work with her. And when I was in London, I sought supervision from a very good analyst, Meltzer, and brought the sessions with this patient. And he said, I think you ought to, when you travel, you ought to let your patient know exactly where you're going to be every place that you're going to travel. And I thought that was such a weird advice. That why should I let the patient know where I am? What was the importance of that? And I came to understand that it had nothing to do with location. It had to do with the patient's sense that that we can be distant, but I still love her. And when you write about love in psychoanalysis, it is considered sentimental. And I think it's an error, because it's so important. It's at the basis of everything. And I also wanted to tell you, Otto Kernberg, who is a Chilean like me, I met him in Chile years ago. He was the president of the Psychoanalytic Association 3 consecutive times, very well respected, has published and everything. He just wrote his last book. And in his last book, he talks about love. Finally, someone is writing about love. And that, and I think for all those changes that we would like to see in the environment, like even Ruskin, to notice a leaf that was turning in a different color when he was painting, he had to love that leaf. He had to care that that leaf had changed color. And he alerted people, something is happening. Climate, something is happening. And he put the warning on it. So that love is at the basis of what we do when we care. And we care, we care about other people, but we care also about the world we live in. So that's what sorry.
No, it's wonderful. Ruskin says in a number of places that we don't see until we love.
Mm-hmm.
Can't see until we love.
Yeah.
So he'll talk about even in nature that if I'm studying a rock and I'm really studying it, its form, its shape, all the elements that go into it, I'm really contemplating that innocently, with an openness. He said that I haven't seen it until I love it,
Mm-hmm.
until I care for it, and then I have to ask, once that's true, then what are my responsibilities towards it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what do you do with it? I recently, this other bit, I recently visited my son who lives in the coast of Chile, 4 hours south of Santiago, in a very beautiful place called Pichilemu, which is a surfing beach. And he built steps going down to the beach from his property to allow people to go to the beach, to his beach. And he didn't charge anything. And people leave all kinds of messages. The surfers especially surfers from Europe and abroad, they leave him messages of thanks for allowing him to use the steps. And also, he put a shower to allow the surfers to wash the feet when they come out of surfing before they get dressed. And that's a loving gesture. And the surfers received it as a loving gesture. So they leave these messages in all languages. That's so great to be able to wash our feet. Nobody had ever thought that they would need to wash their feet. I was very proud of my son that he had the idea, and that he got this love inside of him. So, and I'm advocate with my colleagues about the importance of the feelings, that it's not just theories, that different perspectives that can help. If any perspective can help, if there is love behind it, if it's done with love. And that's what Ruskin, I think I was very moved when I read that his impression at the leaf that was turning, and he warned everybody, something is happening, it's dangerous, we have to do something. He must have loved that tree and that leaf.
Indeed.
Anybody else? I know we're past 6:30 here, which was I think our designated stopping point. So if nobody else has any questions, I'll go ahead and wrap things up. Gabe, thank you again for that masterful discourse, and I'm glad that we have this recorded for posterity. I think it's a great idea to have this available in another format as well, either on the the website or somewhere else. If did another publication even. But I want to mention a couple of upcoming events that we have. We have a couple members only events. One of them is a field trip to the William Clark Library in the West Adams District, and that is on Thursday, June 8th. And then we have some upcoming study sessions on the Saturdays in June, the 10th, 17th, and 24th, where we will be discussing the nature of Gothic from Ruskin's The Stones of Venice, unpacking that a little bit more. And then we have an event in July that's open to everybody. That is a tour of Apricot Lane Farms in Moore Park, which I know that Ruskin himself would be so happy to know a place like this exists. But there's more information about this on our website. And we look forward to having you all at future events. So with that, I think we can turn off the recording and bid everyone adieu.
Mhm.